start and go over Unit 6. So we're going to be talking about tissue, and we are going to lecture and focus on the 4 types of tissues that we have. And specifically, we're going to look at the tissue in respect to its histology, which we are in the process of covering in class. So histology is the study of tissue. And there are 4 tissue types that we're going to talk about today. And those tissues, do you know what they are? We have epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And that's the order that we're going to talk about them as well, in the order that is presented in lab. So let's start and look at these tissues really quick. You can see epithelial tissue, you'll notice here and here. The one that we normally think about first is the skin, cover, or surface, the epidermis, which we're going to talk about. The next is the integumentary system, which is the biggest organ in the body that includes that. Lining of the digestive tract and organs and other hollow organs. So these guys essentially are important because they form boundaries between different environments, protect, secrete, absorb, and filter. The next is connective tissue, and you can see they have them in several places there. The bones, the tendons, and fat, and other soft padded tissue. And so these are important because they help to support, protect, bind other tissues together. The next, you can see muscle, muscle, and muscle. You might be thinking, oh my goodness, we're pointing at the stomach. But the stomach has several different layers. One of them is muscles. And it's important because the walls of hollow organs essentially contract. Think, we're sitting there mixing and digesting food in there and the intestines, and we're pushing stuff through. So they do have this layer of muscle. As well as in the heart, right? And in the skeletal muscle, which allows our bones to move, right? And basically in the hollow organs, it's smooth. So they allow contraction and to cause movement. And the last, if you see up here, you have brain, spinal cords, and nerves, both central nervous system, which is the first 2, and then the nerves in the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. And that allows our body to communicate. It's internal communication.
There are 4 types of tissues, from our heads down to our toes. Epithelium, nervous, connective, muscle, here we go. Epithelium, hey, there are lots of kinds. They are grouped by layer and shape. Simple as one, stratified as more, especially on the heels of an ape. Simple squamous is the first. Single layer, flat and thin, so things can diffuse in glomeruli, lungs, alveoli. Hey, that's how air gets through, but it doesn't protect much. Simple cubital secretes and absorb in tubules of the kidney. Simple glomerular lines your small bronchi to keep your airway clean.
It's columnar, pseudostratified with mucus it secretes. Light of the air which you get rid of dust of the silly sweet.
Stratified cells protect. Squamous is in your cheek and also in your skin, so it's not too thin. They're flattened on the top. Hey, they may be keratinized. They're cuboidal at the base. Cuboidal lines the ducts of the sweat and memory glands. There's plenty of urine in the bladder. It's transitional doing its job. You can stretch it, it'll hold it, it'll change its shape. It won't let water through. Now it's muscles, yes, muscle tissue. Have to stand on your own 2 feet. Smooth, skeletal, and cardiac, which keeps your body beat. The striations make it smooth. Only a single nucleus. You got it in your gut, it moves food along, but it's out of your control. Hey, cardiac is too, both involuntary. Cardiac automatically excites itself, it pumps our blood along. Branching and strident are these cells until you disconnect them all. Are you ready? Hey, are you ready to move? Strident skeletal is voluntary. Bones and skin, these muscles grip multinuclearly. Nervous controls it all. Impulses they conduct. They live a long time, but they don't divide, so you better treat them well. Hey, neuroglia is here to support and insulate. Dendrites bring the message in toward the body of the neuron. Axons move the impulse away, and just like that, they're gone.
Phenomenal, there are vesicles where neurotransmitters release. They go across the synaptic clefts where they are received.
Let's connect it all. There's extracellular matrix, a ground substance, and the fibers with relatively few cells. Hey, in your embryo, it develops from mesenchyme. Blood keeps us alive. Fluid but no fibers. It carries oxygen and some CO2. There are plenty of cells within the blood to protect and keep you strong. Leukocytes, erythrocytes, thrombocytes, they help you clot. Proper, yeah, connective tissue. Of each type there are 3. Areolar, reticular, and adipose. Loose with a density. The other type is dense, with thick collagen fibers. There's regular and irregular, and elastic too. Hey, it's a binding tissue. It resists tension. Cartilage resists compression, providing cushion and support. Mitochondriocytes and collagen. Elastin helps out too. Fibrocartilage, hey, force the disc in your spine. Epiglottis is elastic. Hyaline makes your trachea and larynx and keeps your joints slick. There are 2 types of bone. Spongy or compact. They're calcified and vascularized and made of osteocytes. Hey, they support you through compression and tension. How do you think you can get along without these great tissues? If you were missing any of them, you'd have some real issues.
Did you know it? Do you know it now? Now that the list is complete. If not, we need a review. Just hit repeat.
And I'm sure no one wants to repeat that, right? I love music, though sometimes it hurts to hear things. But I thought it was a really good review in the sense, or at least a fun and silly review of all the different tissues we're going to talk about. Some of you might have passed it after a few, that's fine. But you might see those sporadically throughout my lectures sometimes. Some of them are better than others. So, I like that a lot because it showed different tissues, pictures, the histology, of it. And some of them even compared. So that's what we're going to be doing today for the first part of this, is looking at the different tissues. So we're going to start with the epithelial tissue. And the epithelial tissue has several different characteristics. Now, the characteristics that they have is they have what's known as polarity. And polarity is essentially saying that within it there's a presence of an apical surface. And it's either presented in exterior or presented in a cavity, right? So the apical surface, if you think outside, your body is towards the outside, right? The exterior part of a layer of your skin. Inside, it might be presented at some point in the cavity, but essentially you'll have a top part, and then you could have one, two, or several different layers, and then you'll have something on the bottom, normally connected to the basal membrane. So they do have polarity. The second thing they have is they are supported by connective tissue. So within this, right below, they're supported by connective tissue, and in this like interface, there's a presence of what's known, let me put this, as the basement membrane. And whenever you get cancer of the skin, what can make it really bad and how it can metastasize throughout the body is that the cancer cells can actually dissolve this membrane and then get into the body and move. They have what's known as specialized contacts. Essentially what that means is you can find them in several, so they're found in single or multiple layers. But they're always tightly packed. And within those layers, you might find something like tight junctions. So a tight junction is something, it's a connection between cells that allow nothing to pass through. So it almost makes it like it's completely waterproof, tight, nothing can get through. So they're very, very close together. And then you have desmosomes. And these, I like to say, are kind of like molecular Velcro. They allow you to have or relieve tension, but they're always tightly packed. They're avascular. But they're innervated. So innervated, basically avascular means that they lack blood vessels that right? They're essentially, they get their nourishment through diffusion. Innervated means that nerves do communicate with them. And these guys can regenerate, which means they divide, and it is rapidly. So these are all of the functions of epithelial tissue. I mean, not functions. Why did you let me do that? Characteristics. Sorry about that. I was thinking about what I was about to go to. Now, the functions, so this are the characteristics, what they look like, what they have, what's around them, right? And these guys have very specific functions, and you can think P's, right? They protect. And essentially, they're protecting underlying tissue, right? So think, they have skin. They're in skin or digestive tract lining. So essentially, they're providing that protection underneath for everything that's underneath it. Think excretion. They essentially, an example of this is sweat that's excreted from sweat glands. Sweat glands are found in the epithelial tissue. They're responsible or have the function of absorption. So an example of this is nutrient uptake in the small intestines. And they're important because they have the function of secretion. And so just think of all the multitude of glands that are throughout the body that secrete things like hormones or mucus or enzymes. So these are the functions of epithelial tissue. So, when we're talking about classifying epithelial tissue, though, all epithelial tissue will have two names. One will indicate the number of the cell layers. So you can see on here it says simple epithelial or stratified epithelial. Sorry about that. So simple basically means there's only one layer of cells. Stratified means that there are two or more layers of cells. Essentially, there is something called pseudo-stratified, right? And pseudo, like pseudoscience, it's not real. So pseudo-stratified is going to tell you that it's going to look like it's stratified, that there's several layers, but there's only one. So that's one way that you essentially can part of the name itself, right? It's going to tell you how many cell layers there are. Another way of classifying epithelial tissue is shape. So in here we have squamous, which essentially is going to tell us that it's kind of this flat, kind of stepping stone looking structure, right? It's flat. And cuboidal is going to tell you that it kind of has a cube shape. And columnar is going to be that it looks kind of like a column, right? And so you are going to look at these, and it's very easy to be able to tell what type of tissue you have by looking at the tissue and saying, okay, how many cell layers do I have? Okay, that's going to be part of the name. What does a cell look like? That's going to be another, right? And so in stratified epithelial tissue, whenever we go to classify that, stratified means several layers, right? So in that sense, we're going to look at the apical layer, and that's going to tell us the basically the shape of the cell. And so this shows you squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. You can see up here that you have this kind of slate stone, stepping stone-like looking structure, right? And so that's squamous. Cuboidal, you can see that when you look at this, it's a cube shape, and this guy on the side is very much a column shape, right? So these are just kind of flat, step-like stones, squares, rectangles. And when we're looking at, this kind of gives you an idea here, this simple, do you notice it's just one layer of cells right here? But here, there's several layers. So this is stratified. And when you look at which one or how you're going to look at the shape, you're going to look at the apical side, not the basal site for where underneath it is all the connective tissue. You're going to look at the top that's exposed to the outside. And the outside doesn't need to be outside the body. It could be essentially in one of those hollow organs. And so let's start first with simple squamous epithelium tissue. And so you can find this is simple, right? So simple means what? Hopefully you said it's single layer. And squamous is going to be that flat disc-like shaped cell, right? So this is very simple, one of the simplest epithelial tissues. Its major function is to allow material to pass and diffuse through it, right? And so here, you're not going to get any kind of protection or anything. This is an area, these are found normally in areas that we don't really care, we don't need protection, not that we don't care, that we don't need it. So a perfect example of this is in the air sacs of the lungs, is where you can find this. And this kind of gives you a nice picture of it. Simple cuboidal. So simple, again, is, as you can see, single layer, but here we're looking at the square, the cube-like. So you can see these cube-like structures right here. These are important in secretion and absorption, and you can find those in the kidney, specifically the kidney tubules and the small glands of the thyroid. And you can see these over here. So these are the ones, and you can see when you're looking at this histology, guys, realize that a lot of these have several different tissues on them. So you kind of have to look and locate the tissue specifically. So if I were to show you something like this on a lab practical, you would look and go, okay, I recognize these circles. So this is the actual, right here, is the actual tissue, not all this other stuff that you see here, right? And if you notice, they're in cubes here, right? And this is the basement, and the one that's opened or has the center stuff, do you see how this is all open? That's the apical, but it's only one layer, so it doesn't matter. And these are cubes, so that's how you would go identifying this. Simple columnar, again, simple is one layer, and then you have these rectangles, so they look like really large columns. They're important absorption and secretion of things like mucus and enzymes and other substances, right? A lot of times, they'll have cilia on them, the little hair-like structures. And so you can find them in the digestive tract, the stomach, all the way to the rectum, the uterine tubes, and some of the regions of the uterus. So if you look over here, you'll notice this is the basement, right? So this is the apical region, and you can see the outside exposed here. And if you look, these are single layers and large columns. Now here, you'll notice a gland, and this is or a small cell. This is called the goblet cell. And you can think within your digestive tract, there's lots of mucus that gets secreted to help push things along, right? And so that's what they secrete. And on there, you'll notice there are microvilli on this. And so the microvilli are these large protrusions here. Oops, sorry. And these are different than cilia. Okay. Cilia are, if you go back, let me see if we can see it in the last, I'm going back and forth here. You can't see it, but on the outside, you might see cilia, and it'll be like little hair-like structures that literally just look like little hairs. And the little hairs are important because basically with these hair, these cilia, they'll help kind of move projections that are constantly moving, so they'll help push that mucus through. You'll even see in this area that if you're looking in the uterus, they're little hair-like projections that help to move the egg cell to the uterus once it gets released from the ovaries. So you have those, right? This is showing non-ciliated on here. You can't really see the little guys. But you can get, essentially on here are these things, and so let's go to the next slide here again, that are these microvilli. And these are finger-like little projections here, you can see. So they are different than the cilia. And these microvilli are important because they're going to help to kind of increase surface area. So essentially, it's going to allow nutrients to be absorbed more effectively because there's more surface area for them to go through. So this is simple, which, how many layers? Yes, one. And pseudostratified, what did pseudostratified mean? Hopefully you realize stratified meant more than one layer, right? Pseudo, like pseudoscience, not a real science, not really more than one layer. So if you look at this guy, what it happens is, this looks like there's layer, like layer, and layer, and layer, but it's not. These guys are essentially going all the way down here and back up. Like this guy is basically like this. Let me get a different color here. Green. This guy is basically going like this. And these are the little cilia or the hair you can see here. So that's what pseudostratified is for. So you can find them. They're important for secreting substances, right? Particularly mucus, and they help to move mucus by ciliary actions again. So they're important, and also instead of just moving mucus, they can move general substances too, right? So if you look, non-ciliary ones can move, conduct sperm, right, through ducts. But what we want to look at here, and because I'm trying to keep it consistent between what you're learning here and what you're learning in the lab, the trachea and the upper respiratory system, you can see here, is a common area that you will see this. And that makes sense because as you're breathing, you have all these little hairs. And as you know, if you've ever gotten a cold, you have all this mucus that gets caught up. You're always producing it because essentially when you breathe in, you're going to breathe in. You could breathe in bacteria or viral units or other impurities in the air. And so essentially they lay down, they get caught up in that mucus you produce, and the little hairs are going to move that mucus out of your respiratory system into your digestive system. It goes in the back of your respiratory cavity, and it kind of goes down into the esophagus, and you're going to end up degrading all of that material or digesting it. So this is a perfect example here where you might see that. Stratified squamous. Essentially, stratified is how many layers? More than one. And squamous is the flat kind of cells, right? So these, you're going to see multiple layers. And you can see we're going to look at the apical layer to figure out what the cells look like. So if you see those cells on the top there, they are flat, essentially squamous, right? And then that basement layer down there. So we're looking at that, but you notice there's several here. So these guys are really important in protection. And in certain areas, they're subject to abrasion. So they really want to make sure we know and make sure that they're really strong and hardy. So there's two types. You can see there's non-keratinized And then there's keratinized. So keratin, if you've heard, think about making strong hair, right? You'll hear that on advertisements. So keratin is basically a protein that helps to make stuff really tough, and it aids in protection. So the keratinized forms you're going to find in the epidermis of the skin, right? This is going to be a dry membrane. It's going to be outside, and that keratin is going to help it against essentially abrasion or forces that could damage it. Non-keratinized essentially is going to be moist. Keratin essentially makes the membranes very, very dry, but non-keratinized means it's not going to have that particular protein there. So that's going to form the layers of protection inside your body that are essentially still outside. So think about the outside of your skin, and then go up to your face, and then over to your mouth, and then realize that the outside of your face through your lips to the inside of your mouth are all connected. It's all just one of that layer going from outside, which is keratinized, to the inside, which is non-keratinized. But it's still exposed to the outside nature. You're bringing food in, you're bringing things from the outside there. And that whole basically tube that goes through your whole body is essentially exposed to stuff that you've brought in from the outside, your whole digestive tract. So the moist lining of the esophagus, the mouth, even the vagina, the anus, all of those areas are going to be examples of the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Stratified cuboidal epithelium, to let you know, this is extremely rare. You don't find a whole lot of it. And you should know here, and that's why epithelial section is easy, is because you look at the words and that will tell you kind of what you're seeing here. So we're looking at, again, these circles again. And so this could give you a good idea. Most of the time when you see cuboidal tissue, it's going to be in these round circles. The difference is, do you remember earlier when we were looking at simple cuboidal, you just saw one cell? These little things are the nucleus. Here you're seeing several of them together. So it's cuboidal. They're all these little cubes going in here. It's kind of hard to see. They're found in some sweat and mammary glands, typically 2 layers thick. Their function is in secretion and excretion, and they also have protection and secretion functions. Stratified columnar epithelium. This is also limited distribution in the body. There's a small amount of it in the pharynx, the male urethra, and the lining of some glandular ducts. So this will be stratified, again, is how many layers? Several, and columnar are the rectangles, right? And these, normally you see these in transition areas between 2 types of epithelial. But if you look at it, stratified means that you have a lot of layers. So realize the only one that it looks columnar is the apical layer. And remember, it's not the basement layer that we look at to determine what cell we have or what type of tissue. It's the apical layer we look at, or the top that's exposed to the outside, whether that outside is inside the body or if it's truly outside the body. Transitional epithelial tissue is basically, it resembles both stratified squamous and stratified cuboidal. So if you look at this up here, you can see, right, that you kind of have these different things that up here, it looks very much this kind of squamous. But as you get down to the bottom, it starts looking more cuboidal, right? And you can see it kind of in this cartoon they've given you here. Basal cells are cuboidal or columnar. The surface cell dome shape or squamous-like. So it depends on the degree that the organ is stretching on which one they look more like, right? So the function here is, and the reason why they have this really weird look to them, is because they stretch readily, and it allows you If you think you're finding them in the ureters and the bladder, part of the urethra, right? And so this is where we're storing urine. And essentially distending it, which means that you're releasing, urinating urine, right? So basically, you have to have some give here to allow those organs to increase in size as you're increasing the storage of bladder, and then to contract. So that's why they slightly change due to stretching their shape.
The first type of epithelia is simple squamous. If you didn't have it in you, it would be such a pain, 'cause they're found in your cornea, that's in your eye, and in your alveolus to help you stay alive. Now down in your vagina, they're squamous stratified. In every woman from France to China, they're non-keratinized. So on that rare occasion when you bring home a guy, it will resist abrasion when you put things inside. Oh, epithelia, it's so nice to see ya. 'Cause if I didn't have ya, I would be dead. Now let's talk about cuboidal. They're in your thyroid gland. They're not just for absorption, they're for secretion and by iodination. They make T3 day and night, and by approximation their width is equal to their height. Now if you said columnar, I'd say that's in my ileum, and in my stomach lining where squamous would be cilium. They're packed with microvilli to help absorb the things I've chewed, and the muscularis externa helps to shift along my food. Oh, epithelia, it's so nice to see ya. 'Cause if I didn't have ya, I would be dead. Hey, pseudo-stratified, come on now, tell me what's your game? You could have fooled me, but your pseudo-prefix gave it away. You play all multi-layered, but I see it's all an act. You're all joined to the basement membrane in my upper respiratory tract. That leaves transitional, protecting tissues from urea. You're different and original, and boy am I so glad you're here. I'd be an awful wretch if it weren't for your expertise. My bladder would not stretch, and I could not hold half as much weight. Oh, epithelia, it's so nice to see ya. 'Cause if I didn't have ya, I would be dead. Oh, epithelia, it's so nice to see ya. 'Cause if I didn't have ya, I would be dead. I would be dead.
So that is all about epithelial tissue. So what is carcinoma? My mom actually passed a squamous cell carcinoma. So carcinoma essentially is a cancerous tissue, right? Oops, sorry. Sorry, when it does that, it's because it didn't record or I did something with my pencil, so I'm sorry about that. But so carcinoma is a cancerous tissue. And it originates essentially in the epithelial tissue. So most of the carcinomas begin on the surface that's in contact of the external environment, right? So if you can think of the skin on the outside that protects us from everything on the outside it's super inundated all the time with UV, which is one of the reasons why you want to use skin protectant, right? UV protection. And then what happens is that, because remember how we said that cancer cells can essentially dissolve that basement layer that go into that's right above connective tissue, then it can essentially go into and metastasize and go throughout the rest of the body. That's how it works, right? And so up to about 90% of human cancer are types of carcinoma. Right? And so the characteristics of carcinoma specifically cancer is, do cancer cells die? No, they're really hard to kill, right? So they're continually dividing. So they don't die. Actually, some of the very, very first cells that were put into, that we were able to grow, sorry, I had someone at my door, that we were able to grow, essentially were called HeLa cells. They were named after Henrietta Lacks. And they were actually the very first cells ever grown in culture. They were the first cells to go into space. They were the first cells that we were able to manipulate. They've done tons to advance science. But they were essentially cancer cells. And so cancer cells are extremely robust, and they just continually divide. And they divide at rates that are way faster than our regular cells. So they can outcompete them for resources. And things like, if you know anything about mitochondrial functions in relation to cancer cells, you'll know that there's this thing called the Warburg effect, for which cancer cells make way more glycotic enzymes, so enzymes that are responsible for the process of glycolysis, that a lot of them don't utilize oxidative phosphorylation as much. So they can actually survive on less oxygen because of this. So as they're getting bigger and bigger, forming these huge masses, they're able to support life on less oxygen because they can get more ATP out of glycolysis than normal cells do. So in that regard, they're very, very robust. Cancer cells don't specialize. So if they don't specialize, that essentially means they do not have the characteristics of the starting tissue. So if, for instance, like we're talking about right now with the carcinoma, if you have a cell essentially become cancerous that are in that area, then they're no longer going to act like a skin cell. They're going to act like a cancer cell. So they're not going to be performing the functions that are required in that area, and it can cause your body a lot of havoc. They also lose their ability for, cell adhesion. What does adhesion mean? It means, right, being in place, being securely rooted somewhere. So since they're not actually remaining as a part of that tissue in there, in that area, they can basically penetrate through tissue layers. Including the basement membrane. of the epithelial tissue. And that just means, right? So these are the three characteristics. So with that last part, what does this suggest about cancer-causing agents overall? It means it can cause havoc and they can go body wide, right? And we're going to get more into the different types like carcinoma, melanoma, and all of this when we get into the integumentary system, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So glandular epithelium is composed of cells specialized to produce and secrete substances into ducts or body fluids, right? And so there are different types of glands. You have exocrine and endocrine glands. So what you want to notice here is EX and EN. So this is like exit and this is like enter, right? So glands that are exocrine glands, they secrete their products into ducts that are open into the surface, right? Or to the outside. Outside doesn't necessarily mean to be outside the body. It just has to be that apical and go into maybe a cavity or something in the body. These can be unicellular or multicellular. Endocrine glands, so think endocrine system, they're going to secrete their products into tissue, fluid, or blood, right? So they're going to use the little trails or tracks in our body to get things places. So these are the two types of glands that we have in our body. So if we're talking about unicellular exocrine glands, the only really important ones that we're going to look at are mucus cells and goblet cells. These are found in epithelial lining of the intestinal and respiratory tract, and they produce what's known as mucin. And we saw one of those, right? We looked at that goblet cell. I kind of pointed that out in some of the pictures earlier. And so mucin is this kind of sugar protein that can be dissolved in water to form mucus. And mucus, we all know what that looks like. That's that slimy, protective, lubricating coat that you'll see a lot of times in loogies, right? Or even when you excrete substances from your body through your rectum. So you can see, so mucin is basically the molecule that mixed with water becomes mucus. So that's what these unicellular exocrine glands, so they are just those one individual kind of things that essentially just kind of look like that, if you remember earlier. And then you had all the cells here, and these guys were everywhere. So that kind of just one, right? And it releases kind of to the outside of a cavity or something. And so, yeah. Pretty picture, right? So you can see here the goblet cell, and you can see these little secretory vesicles. So they're secreting these little kind of circularized entities that contain mucin. And so they'll excrete it out, and then it'll mix with water and become mucin. So that kind of gives you an idea of what this unicellular exocrine gland looks like. Now, multicellular exocrine glands, right, they can be subdivided by structure and types of secretion. So you have simple glands, and I'll show you a picture here. They can be branched or compounded, which means they're branched, but they're kind of all together in one. Or they can look tubular, alveolar, or tubular alveolar. Alveolar is kind of a circle, and tubular looks just like tubes. And so that's the structure. So I'm going to go up one and then I'll come back. So here are the structures. So you have here tubular and you have alveolar. So you can see here just long tubes. Here you can see circles, right? So the simple ducts are the first one, which means that the actual ducts themselves do not branch, right? So as you're coming out here, you'll notice this is simple tubular, so they'll give you intestinal, so it just comes straight out. Or this simple alveolar here, so it just comes down and does this simple kind of circle, right? And so that kind of gives you an idea, and then you see on this one there's no important examples in human, right? Now here, if you look, they're simple, right? And they're branched, which means as you come in, this guy is just coming and going around, so you can see those tubes, and they're just branches of tubes. Here, you come in, and there's just branches of the circle, right? So simple just means that one duct is coming in, and either this one, if there's no branching at all, it just goes straight down, or this is the one duct comes in and just branches. Compound means that the ducts are branched. So do you see how this comes in and then it branches and then it branches again? So that's what the compound is talking about, that you're having more than one branching basically. And these are all tubes. They're long tubes coming down. And so in these you can see that you come in and the duct is branching itself, and then it comes and gives you the different alveolar branching at the bottom, right? So all of these you get different examples for here. This is stomach, gastric glands here. This is what, when you get pimples, this is sebation oil glands here in the simple branch. Up here, the duodenal glands. So this is the area in the duodenum at the beginning of the small intestines, where it's the area that's reached first after the stomach when you're digesting and you start absorbing. Here, mammary glands that help produce milk for children, and salivary glands are these that include, if you notice here, it branches at the tube, but then you have alveolar, tubular, alveolar. Alveolar, alveolar, tubule. Alveolar, tubule, alveolar. So basically you're looking and just saying, okay, do I see tubes? Do I see circles? Do they just branch once, or that's simple, do they branch multiple times? That's compound. So this is how you can basically, their structure is the first way that you can subdivide them. The next is the type of secretion. So merocrine, oops, why did you do that? Merocrine is the first one. This is the most common, and it secretes by producing both exocytosis. So here, it releases as soon as it's made. Holocrine, you're going to accumulate the project or products, and then it's going to rupture, right? So this, it's basically like you're filling up a balloon, right? And you keep adding air and air and air, and then it pops. Apocrine is basically you accumulate the products, but the whole here, the whole gland ruptures. Here, only the apex ruptures. And there's controversy of whether they exist in humans or not. So let's look here really quick and see the two, right? So merocrine here, you can see, here's your gland. You can see that the cells here are producing them, and they're releasing it by exocytosis. So as they make it, they release it and the secretions go out. Right? Here, so you can see here that it's in salivary glands right down here. Apocrine, you can see in the mammary glands right here. Essentially what happens is that you have these cells and they're accumulating, right? And pinches the apical part, right? Just small parts of the cell pinch off and get released. Here, example of a sebaceous gland, right? This is how they believe, but there's some There's some controversy in whether or not this works exactly this way, but you can see essentially what happens is the cell, sorry, I flipped it. So the apocrine, sorry, I got it flipped in my head. The apocrine is the one that we see it here, but they feel like this possibly could be more like how this works or like how this works. But the example that they give, some people believe that it's very much apparent in mammary glands. And the sebaceous glands, basically how this works is that the cell gets released, it disintegrates as it goes out and releases its content into the whole thing, and basically new cells form behind it. So this one, there's just coming and taking pieces of it off, where this one, the whole cell is, right?
There are 3 types of exocrine glands. They secrete into ducts, not in blood, you see. Merocrine just releases substance. Mucus is one of these. Apocrine glands release small portions of their cell bodies when they do secrete. They are found in the groin area, and armpits not so sweet. Holocrine glands secrete whole cells. The sebaceous gland secretes that oil well.
I'm sure you guys were extremely excited about that one, right? I used to love the Brady Bunch when I was a kid. Anyway, now we are officially done with epithelial cells, and we are going to move on to connective tissue. So, connective tissues have several functions, and you can see Miss Patty here, right? They're important in movement, insulation, support in other tissues, storage. They protect vital organs. They form the attachment of tissues and organs. They help to transport things, and they help with immunity. So you can look at here and go, okay, to remember this is Miss Patty, right? That can help you a little bit. But let's also look at what their characteristics are when we are looking at them. What things do they visually look like? What do they incorporate? And so here are the characteristics. Include the following. They are the most widely distributed tissue type in the body. They consist of cells that are distributed in what's known as an extracellular matrix. They're further classified by contents of the extracellular matrix. What can we find within it? And lastly, they have varying degrees of vascularity. And actually, I just like to also point out that they arise for the most part, from mesenchymal cells. So mesenchyme cells, right? And that's basically within the embryonic tissue. So when we're looking at connective tissue structurally, they have three elements: ground substance, which you can find in the background, right? And ground substance is basically kind of this unstructured, it's terrible, material that fills interstitial places between blood vessels and cells. The fibers, there's actually 3 different types of fibers. Let me move to a different page here. For the fibers, there's collagen. And this guy is strong, so it's important in strength. Collagen essentially is stronger than steel fibers, so it's really, really strong. You have elastin fibers. These are important. They are strong, but they're flexible. And reticular fibers are branched, and they tend to look kind of spongy. And so I like to think of this for networking. And the last part are cells that you can see in there, right? So sometimes you'll see blast cells. These are used to develop the tissue. So you might see chondroblast. You might see osteoblast, which we've talked osteo before. Or you might see fibroblast. They help to develop tissues. They also have cells in them called cyte cells, right? And these help to maintain tissues. So on here, you could see chondrocytes or osteocytes, or even an example is adipocytes. And in these cells, you can essentially see them different places. So chondroblast, think of cartilage when we get there. Osteoblast, you're going to find in bone. And fibroblast, you're going to find in connective tissue proper. And so composition and arrangement varies in different connective tissue, and that's what we're going to look at. So you can essentially look at here all the different, so this is kind of a cartoon representation of what you see. So when we're talking about the ground substance, you can see that here, that's in the background for which everything else is bathed in. And when we're talking about the fibers, you can see this collagen fiber here, right? Very, very thick. That's going to be there for strength. You can see the elastin there, a little bit thinner than collagen, still for strength, but it allows for some give. And then the thinnest, but you'll notice here, look at it, it's very much branched all over the place. That's going to be there to help in basically bringing these network of fibers together. And then, of course, you can see all these different types of cells there. Macrophages are going to be immunity cell that we'll talk about later when we get into that section in the second part of the class. These are going to help to eat things and get rid of kind of waste, debris, and any kind of organism that shouldn't be there. The fibroblast, you can see that huge cell there. Blast, again, are the cells that are responsible for what? Developing tissue, right? So fibroblasts, this is going to be apparent in those types that are dealing with connective tissue. And if you look here at the top, it's showing you this is a prototype or model of a connective tissue, specifically alveolar connective tissue. And that is going to be, if you notice, I said you'll see in a connective tissue proper. So connective tissue, that's why you see this fibroblast here. And then a lot of these other things all have to do with immunity cells, and we're not going to get as much detail into those. We'll talk about those more when we get into immunity. So, the comparison in the classes of different connective tissue, you'll see here, and this is presented in your book, right? These are the different subsections. So you can see connective tissue proper, cartilage. If you go to the next page, you'll see bone, bone and blood. So those are all basically the classes within connective tissue. Go back. And you'll notice that you can subdivide them. So you're going to have loose and dense connective tissue. That's going to talk about how much area you can see between fibers. And essentially, we're going to go through every single one of these and kind of look at it and identify the cell types, the subclasses, the cell types, with the matrix or the ground substance, which you can find in there, and the general features of each. But you can see there, you can physically notice there is a difference when looking at the histology of what they look like. So when you get into cartilage, it's very easy to see, sorry guys, these little round circles with the cells in them versus lines, right? Versus what bone is very specific and blood looks like. So let's go over these. So areolar loose connective tissue looks like this. So areolar, I'm trying to figure out here. Okay. So you can see that this kind of off-white pink stuff in the back, that's your ground substance. You can see that in this, you have several different fibers. You have the connective or collagen fibers here, which are really, really big, right? You have the elastin fibers here as well. And if you look really, really tiny, that's harder to see. You can kind of see all of these going around. That the branching, it's kind of hard to kind of see here, and they're all over. You have reticular fibers here as well. So all three of your fiber types here. The main cell type that you see are fibroblasts, and they're important in wrapping and cushioning organs, right? And essentially, they're also important in kind of helping to hold and convey fluid, so a reservoir for water and salts. So a lot of times you can see swelling in these tissues. That's edema, right? And they're important in regulating immune function. And they talk about that with macrophages, basically eating. Phagocizing means that they're bringing them in and eating bacteria. Locations that you can see with these are epithelial of the body, packaging around the organs, and they kind of give you an idea of where you can see it on here as well. So this one is the most widely distributed tissue. Adipose loose connective tissue. Adipose is fat. And so you can see these are the cells itself, and then it has fat within it, right? So these fat cells are essentially known as adipocytes, right? And you can see that here. And they're called loose because you can see there's a lot of kind of areas between the cells, essentially. It helps to provide fuel reserves and insulation against heat loss, and it helps to actually protect organs. So think your fat that you generate on your hips or around your organs and so forth. You can find it subcutaneously, which is right under the skin, around the kidneys and eyeballs, and with the abdominal and in the breast. Reticular loose connective tissue. Again, if you see, you can see a lot of kind of these white or light lavender areas in between. So that's going to give you the idea that it's loose connective tissue versus dense. And it's reticular because you can see all these networks. It's kind of hard to, let me get blue there. All these networks of fibers. So you're going to see reticular fiber here. They help basically anywhere that the tissue you need needs to have some give, right? So these fibers help to support just kind of these small internal skeletons that support cell types, including like white blood cells, mast cells, macrophages. All of these are going to be immunity cells, right? So you can find them in the lymph nodes and the spleen. So now we're getting, do you see how all of these have kind of white areas that you can see where there's ground substance or empty areas? That's how you know they're loose. When you get to dense, you don't have a lot of these empty, clear areas, right? Dense is here. And then regular, see how all these fibers are going in the same direction. So that's going to tell you that it's regular connective tissue. Now in here, you're going to have collagen fibers. There's very few elastin. You can see, kind of hard to see, but there's very few elastin. And then they also have fibroblast here. They help to attach muscles to bone or to muscles, muscle to muscle or muscles to bone. They also help to attach bone to bone. They help to withstand a lot of tensile strength or force when they're pushing. So you can see essentially here, do you see where the bones are meeting? And so you're basically looking at these guys being tendons or ligaments. Dense irregular. So you could see that all of this stuff that's everywhere, do you see how it doesn't have a nice shape where everything's going one direction, right? So that's what gets it irregular here. And you don't see a lot of that back open clear space. So here, they're primarily made up of collagen fibers, but again, they do have some elastic fibers. Their main cell type is a fibroblast again, and you can find them in the fibrous capsule of joints and the dermis of the skin. So hopefully you're seeing kind of some similarities and dissimilarities between the different connective tissues so far. Dense, not seeing a whole lot of clear space. And do you see how you're seeing kind of these lines all going in the same direction, right? Well, think about an elastic waistband. You can kind of see them forming these kind of lines to allow for you to increase the length, right, later. So this contains high portion of elastic fibers. It allows the tissue to recoil and stretch, go back, and then stretch up if it needs to again. So it's in the large arteries and the ligaments. So now we're getting out of the connective tissue proper, and now we'll start seeing where you can see these kind of like little bowls with little cells in them. The bowls are called lacunae, and the cells in here we have hyaline cartilage, so they're called chondrocytes. And so in here you mostly have collagen fibers. Chondroblasts produce the matrix when we're talking about collagen here, but overwhelmingly the most common cell you see in here are chondrocytes. They help support and reinforce, and they serve as this resilient cushion, and they resist compressive stretch. What that means, you can see them here, right? Here you have the breastplate and you have the ribs. And constantly your ribs are expanding and compressing, expanding and compressing while you breathe. And so that kind of gives some, it kind of allows it to support this area around it and cushion the area, but it gives it some give. So it covers the end of long bones in joint capsules, and it also forms costal cartilage, which is what this is called here, that connects the breastbone to the plates, right, and the ribs. You can find this cartilage also in the nose, the trachea, and the larynx. Elastic cartilage, again, you can see it's going to be cartilage because you have those bowls called lacunae with the little cells in them, and they're called chondrocytes. The matrix is pretty much filled in and does not have a lot of that open space. So it's similar to hyaline cartilage. It just has more elastic fibers in it. It's there to maintain the shape of structures while allowing great flexibility. So supports the external ear. As you can see, you can move that thing around and it doesn't give you any problems. And it's also part of the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is the thing, if you sing or you talk or you go, and it stops the air, that's the area of the epiglottis. Fibrocartilage here, you can see these little areas again. You see you have these lacunae with the little cells in them, so you know you're still at cartilage. But the difference is, do you see how it looks like it's a mixture of the two? You have those, but you have these lines in it too. So you can think the fibers are more apparent in this, right? So this has thick collagen fibers that are very predominant, and the matrix is very similar to the hyaline cartilage. It's just less firm because of this fiber that's in it. Its function is tensile strength that allows it to kind of absorb compression here. So you can find these in the intervertebral disc. The pubis symphysis is the area that you have right between the two hip bones and the disc of the knee joints. Bone looks like tree trunks that are cut in half, right? So here, what you're seeing is the little lacunae aren't going to be these big round bowls that are really prominent. It's going to be these little dots here. And within the dots, you're going to get osteocytes that are in them, right? This is very well vascularized, which means there is, especially in this area that you see in the middle of the central canal, you're going to have blood vessels in that area, right? So this helps to support and protect, provides levers for the muscles to act on so that we can move, right? Plus, it's allowing us to store calcium and other minerals there. And it is the site for blood cell formation, which is hematopoiesis, right? And so the location of this is incorporated in the bones. And blood. So connective tissue, you can think here, you might not think blood and bone is a connective tissue, but it's helping think everything here is something that's helping to connect the body in some way. And blood is basically a connection in your whole body. If you release hormones in one area, that your body's going to use your blood vessels to get those hormones to a different part of your body. So that's why it fits into connective tissue. Within it, you'll notice that you have red and white cells, blood cells. So these are red blood cells. That's going to be what's important to carry oxygen. They're called erythrocytes, the official term for them. And here you can see these guys. These are essentially called white blood cells. Or neutrocyte, having a brain fart, or called leukocytes. Yeah. And essentially within all of that, I'm trying to see where I am. There, yeah. So here they're showing you different ones. This is a neutrophil and this is a lymphocyte, and those are all within the white blood cells. So, and then on top of this, you have things like here you'll have little platelets, and then you have the plasma, which is a fluid behind it, right? So erythrocytes, leukocytes are the two main cell types in there. And these are important for transporting respiratory gases, nutrients, waste, and other substances. And they're contained within blood vessels.
Connective tissue stores, it frames supports body. Intercellular substance is called matrix, you see. Loose connective tissue, membranes delicate. Collagen, elastic gel, fibroblast resident.
Yeah, I can't even handle that one. So, the last two, so I know this feels a little overwhelming, and it will in our lab class as well. But we're almost done. If you can get through epithelial tissue and connective tissue, it's all downhill from here. So the last tissue, or second to last tissue we're going to cover is the muscle tissue. This is highly vascularized, which means there is a blood source to it. It's responsible for most types of movement, and there's three types. There's skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle tissue here. Skeletal, let's see what I have here. Muscle is what's considered, or it's found in skeletal muscle tissue is found in skeletal muscles. That's voluntary. That's what's going to allow our arms and our legs and our parts of our body to move. Cardiac muscle tissue, that's found, think cardiac is in heart, and that's involuntary. And smooth muscle tissue is found in hollow organs other than the heart, and that's involuntary. And what I mean by involuntary is, do you have to think about it for it to happen? As in, if you move your arm, whether you are consciously doing it or not, may almost seem subconsciously, but you are directing that movement, i.e. you can make it stop. Cardiac and smooth, you don't think about it. It just happens. So that's the difference between voluntary and involuntary. So you can see skeletal muscle here. It's long and cylindrical, and it's multinucleated, which means it has lots of these nucleuses for the different cells. It is also striated, and what I mean by striated, do you see these lines that go down this way? That's what's known as striation, and we're going to get more into actually how muscle cells work when we get into that section. For the purpose of this and what we're doing at this part, we're just talking about the tissue, allowing you to identify it in some of its physical attributes, and then later we're going to get into the physiology and talk more about the details of the structure. Of course, like I said before, it's involuntary movement. It allows you to move, as in locomotion, or manipulate your environment, move stuff, change things. It's important in facial expression, involuntary control, and you find it in your skeletal muscles. So that's essentially muscles that's attached to bones or occasionally to skin. Cardiac muscle, it's branched. So do you see, you can see things going, and you're like, no, not another song. Anyway, you can see it seems like it's going all in these different directions, right? Versus this one, a moment ago, was very, very uniformed and straight throughout. And so that's how you can tell it is striated just like before. So if you look, you can see all the little lines going here. It's uninucleated, which means when you're looking at these, there's one nuclei per cell, where the last one was multi. They have specialized junctions, which are called intercalated disc, which you can see right here, right? Its function is to contract, and it propels blood into circulation. It's voluntary control. So when we're looking at this, essentially, it's in the heart of the wall. And smooth muscle is the last muscle that we'll talk about. It has these spinal shapes. It almost in some way looks more like a connective tissue than muscle because we're so used to seeing striations, but it's not. And so don't be tricked by that. Some people are very much tricked by that and thinking that it's some kind of connective tissue. And so we don't want you guys to get that wrong. It has a central nuclei, no striations, and the cells are arranged closely to form these sheets. It's important because it propels substances or objects, like things like food or urine or even a baby, along internal passageways, and it's completely involuntary. So you can think of mostly in the walls of hollow organs, so it's very much present in the stomach and in the intestines. Yeah, I won't do that to you guys today. So the nervous tissue is the last tissue we're going to talk about, and it's the main component of the nervous system. So you can find it in the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, and it's important because it regulates and controls the body function through signaling. So it has two basic characteristics to it in the sense that it has irritability, which means that it's very easy to stimulate or activate. And it has conductivity, which means it's easy for it to transmit signals. There's two main types of cells within nervous tissue. There are neurons, which are specialized nerve cells, and these are the ones that are going to communicate back and forth within the nervous system. So they generate and conduct nerve impulses, and neuroglial cells will support cells, or they're the supporting cells that support, insulate, and protect the neurons. So the neuron is basically the lead actress or actor, and the neuroglial cells are the supporting cast. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So these right here, this is a perfect example here of a nerve cell, and then the little dots in the back that you see, those are neuroglial cells. Now, these guys, they're branched, the neurons are, and they're composed of, you can see here, this is an axon, and these are dendrites. And basically information comes in here and out here. And this is the cell body known as also a soma. So they help to transmit electrical signals, right? From sensory receptors to the effectors, which are going to cause the change in the body. And that's what controls activities. And of course, the neuroglial cells are the supporting cells. And you can find those in brain, spinal cord, and the nerves. And so at this point, I'm going to stop and do a break. And I'm going to start up the next one with essentially part 2 of Unit 6.